Hey, everybody, and welcome to episode 0 of For Food's Sake, a podcast bringing you down to earth dialogues about the food on your plate and its many impacts on the people and the planet. My name is Matteo De Vos, and this episode, which is in a way a prelude to the first real episode, is about the why. Why am I launching a podcast? Why a food podcast? What is it about? And why you might be interested in staying along for the long ride. So food in general, and its link to sustainability in particular, has been something that's generally interested me for a very long time. And one of the things I've realized as I've become more interested and curious over time is how many interesting people there are, how many projects and how many initiatives there are out there, and how many different ways there are in which that people can engage and work with food. So the initiative that I'm taking here, I guess the main reason for starting this podcast is to reach out and to talk to as many of these individuals as possible. It's to have down-to-earth dialogues, genuine, easy-to-follow conversations with individuals that are working closely with food and food-related issues. And in doing so, my goal is to learn from those who are working in the field, so to speak. And as someone who is curious and as someone who is, I should add, by no means an expert, I want to try and keep these conversations as genuine and as grounded as possible. I'm hoping to make this podcast appealing to a broad and diverse group of people that have varying degrees of interest and opinions on all these topics. So my aim here is to really, I guess in a nutshell, is to keep an open mind about everything I discover through interviewing these individuals, and to really learn more about my role and my responsibility as a consumer of food, and what I can realistically do to mitigate my own effects. And finally, I guess by listening to this podcast, by participating in this podcast with me, I hope that you can also learn a bit more about your role in the food chain, but also more generally about the awesome ways in which that people around the world are working on food issues and the ways in which they're trying to mitigate the many issues surrounding food. So before I go into a little bit more detail about the types of topics and initiatives that I'd like to be discussing on this podcast in the future, I thought it would only be fair if I started with myself, if I gave a brief synopsis of my current views and understanding of some of these issues that I want to be talking about for the sake of transparency. I'd just like to stress here again that I don't want this podcast to be one that pushes a particular agenda. Again, like I said, I'm no expert, and I'm not saying that my own views are the right ones. In fact, I'm very open to my own views changing over the course of this podcast, and that's one of the many reasons, actually, that I've decided to start a podcast in the first place. But like I said, for transparency, I thought it's only fair if I spell out my own views for you first. So, what I think is so fascinating about food is that it plays such an integral part of our lives. It can be so personal to people's identities, to their culture, to their traditions, whilst at the same time, the process through which we get our food, so our wider relationship with the food chain and the food system, has become more and more detached over time. I think we've become more and more disconnected from the food system and from the food chain. And like with so many issues today, in a globalized world that we currently live in, we sometimes, or we tend to quite generally turn a blind eye to what lies behind our consumption of certain goods. So you might take certain consumer goods, for example. We often turn a blind eye to certain labor standards in the textile industry for the clothes that we wear. We often neglect certain environmental concerns with our everyday habits, for example, in the plastic that we use, or sometimes still as well in terms of animal rights abuses for beauty products. And I think with food, we're very much facing the same issues. There doesn't seem to be a lot of transparency about how food is produced or how it's handled, who does the handling and how they're treated, and also just who and what is affected by the demands that we have as consumers of food. Now, I'm certainly not alone in being more and more interested in finding out more about food and our relationship with it. I think it's fair to say that, generally speaking, people are becoming more and more aware and interested in reconnecting with food and rekindling a kind of special lost relationship that we used to have with food. If we ever had one, maybe perhaps that's something that's glorified. I think there's an urge in general for people to be better informed about the food that we're eating, to uncover more about the food chain and our role in it, and in general just to know more about how food affects us and our surroundings. The fact that people are more and more interested in food, I think that's also created another problem, which we have today, which is that there's an overwhelming amount of contradictory advice, evidence, and general noise about food choices and about the food system out there. So from personal experiences, I find that as you delve into some of the research, you find yourself being more and more confused. And you start to feel almost paralyzed about what you can realistically do, what you should do, or what you must do in order to be a conscious, guilt-free, if that's possible, consumer of food. It's also often a debate that can turn ugly pretty fast. Whether it's about meat consumption, about organic versus non-organic foods, local versus global foods, GMOs, you name it. It's a very controversial debate. And these debates are ones that I found myself increasingly being both drawn towards and in some cases being dragged into. A little over a year ago, I decided to become a vegetarian. Actually, it was on October the 1st, after having experimented for a few months of cutting down on meat and fish, that I decided to go cold turkey. And I remember it was after a speech by Jeremy Rifkin, who's an American economist and an author, who was visiting Paris at the time. And in his speech, he was making, he was making these huge, grandiose, dramatic claims about the environment and the fate of humanity, and it left quite a big impression on me. But what stunned me the most was a little off-the-cuff remark he made about meat. I don't think a lot of people noticed, and it's not something that he dwelled on, but I remember that he said something along the lines of, "And if we can't even cut red meat out of our diet, God help us all," something like that. And just to put this into context, this was a speech that hadn't really mentioned the food system or the role of food and sustainability at all. I mean, he'd been talking about public transport and energy, the role of energy and oil, gas, and coal. And he'd been talking a lot about the Internet of Things, which is something that he specializes in now. But it was that one little remark that really struck me. And it got me researching more, and it really convinced me, primarily for environmental reasons, to try being a vegetarian. And so here we are, a little over a year later, and the experiment's ongoing. I can't say it's always been easy, but I can't say it's been super difficult either. But what's really been interesting is how, often in the face of criticism or just mere curiosity about, me turning into a vegetarian, I found myself researching more and more about food in general, and about its about the many sustainability-related issues that surround food, almost as a way of kind of backing up or doubling down on my rather spontaneous decision to become a vegetarian. And what I found is, like most things in life, is that the debate is much more nuanced and complicated. So not just on the meat issue alone, but also on other food-related issues. And rather than kind of shy away from these nuances and complexities, my position today on almost every food-related issue is one that very much embraces these nuances and complexities. Let me give you some more concrete examples on where I stand exactly on certain food issues that I consider, at least from a personal perspective, to be most important. On the subject of meat, I think we need to drastically cut down on meat consumption in general and red meat consumption and dairy consumption in particular. That is, if we're serious about meeting the environmental demands set by climate scientists in order to prevent catastrophic climate change. In terms of local versus global foods, this is an issue I'm really interested in and I want to learn more about. I'm convinced that local food has a really important role to play in reconnecting communities with the food chain and with the food system, and that it's a great way of combating the dominance of big agribusiness. But I'm not convinced it's necessarily more environmentally friendly. Just from a a logical standpoint, to me, it doesn't make much sense to grow tomatoes in greenhouses in Northern Europe during the winter with all its associated energy needs when they could be exported en masse with the benefit of economies of scale from warmer climates further south. In terms of organic food, I'm convinced here that for health reasons at least, a pesticide-free, antibiotic-free, hormone-free food system makes a lot of sense. Again, though, on the environmental side, I have my concerns. Organic farms are increasingly being bought, they're being appropriated by big agribusiness. And so what's happening is, as these farms are being gobbled up by big players, they end up using the same distribution systems as big agribusiness. And so I'm not so sure, at least from an environmental perspective, that a lot of organic alternatives are necessarily alternative. There's also genuine concerns about the conditions under which food workers work. There's a lot of reports of undocumented migrants in Spain, for instance, in the United States as well, working in awful conditions and quite frankly being exploited and taken advantage of because of the situation that they're in. And whilst this is definitely not something that's unique to the organic industry, there's a need, I guess, to realize that organic, like non-organic, like all foods, aren't always innocent. Another area that I'm really interested in is the future of food. So this includes topics like urban farming, the role of permaculture more generally, which I think have a huge role to play in meeting the dietary needs of future generations. I think we also need to make enormous progress on plant-based foods that mimic the taste of meat, and on lab-grown meat as an ethical and environmental alternative to factory farms. I think if we're going to convince the majority of meat eaters in the world to turn towards more vegetarian diets, we're going to have to make progress on both of these issues. I think agricultural subsidies also need to drastically change. I think they predominantly prop up big agribusiness and only worsen the often precarious financial situations of everyday farmers. But again, these are all issues that I want to learn more about by talking to individuals that are directly involved in all of these areas. So those are some of the positions that I take on some of the food issues that I'm interested in. What I want to do is to explore the nuances of these topics, and many other topics actually, by asking questions that are relevant and that make sense for people who are interested in doing something or at least knowing more about these issues. So in the coming months, on a weekly basis, I'll be discussing food-related issues in detail with people working directly with these issues. Here's a bit of a broader overview of the topics I'm lining up for discussion. I'll be talking about food miles and local food. So I'll be asking, is it always better to eat local? If not, how feasible and helpful is it to pursue an alternative diet based on seasonality, for example? Should we refrain from eating strawberries or avocados in the winter if we're living in a cold climate? Does that make environmental sense? Does it make sense from a health perspective? In terms of organic versus non-organic food, is it ultimately better to go organic? And better for whom? The environment or your health? In terms of local, seasonal, and organic foods in general, I'll also want to explore the pitfalls and contradictions of valorizing a system that, at least at times, is based on exploiting migrant wage labor. In terms of modern farming, I want to look at the movements that are looking to empower local farmers, to reconnect individuals with the food chain and with the farmers, and also look at the role of big agribusiness and agricultural subsidies. The whole vegetarian and veganism debate. Instead of getting bogged down in what is rather a polarizing debate of vegans versus meat lovers, I instead want to explore some of the day-to-day questions that I often ask myself as someone that's only recently turned a vegetarian. So if you're concerned about your carbon footprint, what food choices can you make that make sense? Does it make more sense, for instance, to be a lacto-ovo vegetarian where you don't eat meat or fish, but you do eat eggs and dairy? Or for environmental and perhaps even ethical reasons too, does it make more sense to cut out dairy and perhaps eat certain leaner meats like chicken instead? I also think it's very interesting to explore the personal and collective responsibility that we have in all of these choices. So, where does individual responsibility start and where does it end? Is it irresponsible, for example, and maybe even a privileged idea to believe that you can change the world one meal at a time, or to vote with your fork, so to speak, when policy maybe could be far more effective and wide-reaching? Or, on the other hand, have governments and policies repeatedly shown that they aren't consistent enough and determined enough to overcome the sustainability challenges that we face? Are cattle inherently bad for the environment is another topic I want to discuss. Or can holistic livestock management that's supposed to build biodiversity, enhance sustainability, improve the health of soil, can that alternative management system really work on a global scale? I also want to look at other diets. Paleo diet, the gluten-free diet, is gluten really that bad? And the lactose-free diet. Processed foods. Beyond the obvious health concerns alone, where could they, or do they at all, still make sense? Genetically modified organisms, again, how do we separate superstition from real associated dangers with these technological developments? Then there's also the topic of food waste. I mean, can we really justify throwing away almost half of the food that we produce in the Western world? And if we can't, then what can we do about it? And then finally, the topic of the future of food, which I mentioned before. How feasible is it to grow lab-grown meat on industrial scales? Can it really replace factory farm meat? And what about plant-based meats that mimic the taste and even the blood of meat? Is that maybe a way forward? All right, I hope that gives you a bit of a better understanding as to why I'm starting this podcast, and a bit of an overview as to some of the topics that I hope to be discussing. Of course, if you've got any suggestions or any feedback about certain topics that I haven't mentioned that could be interesting to explore, I'm all ears. If you've got any other suggestions or advice, also feel free to contact me. And of course, feel free to check out the For Food's Sake website at www.forfoodsake.me. So that's it for this introductory episode. The first full episode of the For Food's Sake podcast is now available. It's called The Climatarian Diet. I talk with Mark Pershin, the CEO and founder of Less Meat, Less Heat. It's a nonprofit whose mission is to reduce the consumption of meat most damaging to the climate by promoting a climatarian diet. Be sure to check it out and let me know if you like it. Thanks a lot, guys.